Who are you? Who are you? It's one of the most deceptively basic questions that someone can ask you. Who are you? How might you respond to that question? How do you respond to a question so simple yet so deceivingly hard? My bet would be that some of us might identify ourselves by our profession, right? Perhaps what they're asking is, what do we do with our lives, right? What is it that we spend most of our time doing? If you think about it, many people work traditional 9-to-5s, 8-to-5 jobs, right? Spending 40 hours a week, right, at their jobs. It would be easy to say that you are perhaps what you dedicate your time to. Perhaps some of you might begin to answer that question in a different way. Some of you might begin with family ties. I remember a couple of summers ago, I was at a summer program at a school, and the professor asked us to introduce ourselves. And as we're getting ready and starting to think, okay, how do we introduce ourselves to this new group of people whom we've never met, people from all across the country, right? He says, but I want you to introduce yourself by describing your family ties, right? I thought, oh man, that's different. Okay, well, who am I? According to family ties, okay, well, I'm a brother to my sister, I'm a son to my parents, right? I have multiple cousins, right? My family ties include Mexico, El Salvador, right? And even up until recently, we learned Guatemala, right? And so the question of family ties is a large one. It can go quite far. It might be a little complex. Who are you according to family ties? And yet some others might begin by listing off accomplishments, listing off locations that they've lived, perhaps somewhere where you're located now, your lineage, whatever affiliations you might have. Whatever the case, however we answer that question about who are you, who are we, our first response typically always begins with our name, right? Our names begin this dive into who we are. My name is Pablo Josue Diaz, right? I carry the name of my father and of my great-grandfather, my dad's grandpa. Josue is Spanish for Joshua. It's a strong biblical name. Joshua 1:9 has been a verse of the Bible that's kind of followed me my entire life. It's been there since the beginning. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Joshua. You know, I've been called many things in my life. To colleagues in my professional life, to some friends, they call me Pablo, right? To other friends who I've known for a long time and in different stages of my life, they might call me PJ, right? For Pablo Josue. To my baseball team, they would call me the paletero man, which translates to the ice cream man. To my family and to those who've seen me grow up, I'm Pablito, little Pablo. And to my sister, when we were young, when we were just kids, I'm Palito, which literally translates to a stick, but she couldn't say Pablito, so she would say Palito, right? The names we carry gives us a glimpse into who we are, the relationships that we hold, and they give us a glimpse into the stages of our lives and the sort of identities that we've held during those stages of our lives. Our names show how our connections and our relationships have shaped us. And names are really only the beginning of how we form our self-understanding. Identity, what it's shaped by, how it's formed, and who influences your identity. Who are you? Last week we mentioned that the sleepy, reluctant prophet has been peppered with these questions from the sailors. Jonah has been asleep at the bottom of the ship, symbolically trying to stay away from God's presence, being at the deepest part, shoving himself into the depths of the ship to be away from the presence of God. And in this storm, the sailors have come down to him and asked him to pray. And Jonah stayed silent. They finally cast lots, and it was determined that it was Jonah whose fault it was that they were in this predicament, that the waves were crashing against the ship and the wind was howling with immeasurable force. And they turned to Jonah and they asked him, "Who are you, Jonah? What is your line of work? What country are you from? What is your nationality?" And last week we mentioned that Jonah's journey to self-recognition began here. Jonah was running away from his responsibility as God's prophet. He no longer wanted to identify with that part of himself. There was something within him that struggled with what God was calling him to, and so he runs. But it's through this conversation with these sailors that self-recognition begins to happen. It's almost as God is speaking through the sailors and asking and reminding Jonah, "Jonah, who are you? What have I called you to? From what people have you come? What is your mission, Jonah? Where are you going? Who are your people?" Oh man, these questions are good. These are really good because these questions here, they sort of uncover a fundamental truth about humans. And it's that our identity has multiple aspects to it, and that our identity is tied with others. That we can't just claim this lone individual identity that we ourselves form by ourselves in isolation. We as human beings are social, communal people. And you know, all of us do many, many things in life, right? We've worked or we've spent our lives working, we rest. Many have married, right? Many of you have married, many of you have traveled. We've all created something here in our lives, but what are we all doing it for? There's this sense in which where so many of the things that we identify with serve the purpose of either significance or security. So many of the things that we do and we pursue and that we've spent our life building, the things of our identity have been for significance and security. But there's something here. There's something to the sailors' questions that I think is worth recognizing, and something that might slip under the radar for people who are in our Western culture. Something that we might not be privy to. For the sailors here, their goal is to understand the God who has sent this storm, this God who has been angered, so that they can decide what they can do next now. How can they appease this God that's angry? Because you see, in ancient times, every people group, every place, every social location, among many professions, there have been people and gods connected to each people and to each profession, and they all had their own gods. And you notice that they don't ask Jonah the name of his God. They sidestepped that question completely. All they had to do was ask Jonah who he was. Because in their minds, our human identity factors were inextricably linked to what it is that we do, to what we worship. How we identify for them is tied to our worship. In other words, who you were and what you worshipped were just two sides of the same coin. Who you were and what you worshipped were two sides of the same coin. It was a fundamental layer of your identity. So the question, who are you for these sailors, is really, whose are you? From who are you to whose are you? As Christians today living in the 21st century, for us, we don't really believe that each one of our professions carries its own God, right? Not really believe, we don't believe, right? We don't believe that each one of our professions carries its own God, right? We don't have gods for each one of our own professions that we kind of pray to, right? We don't have fertility gods like Baal that we would pray to or sacrifice to. We don't have gods like the god of Mercury, who is the god of commerce, right? But even so, we don't escape this question of whose are we? Because everyone gets an identity from something. And so we must all say to ourselves, I'm significant because of this, and I'm acceptable because I'm welcomed by them. I matter here today in this society because I contribute this. I'm a somebody, or my somebodyness I know because of them. There's a sense in which here that despite our best efforts and despite our attempts at humility, we latch on to and see ourselves differently from the rest because of this and them. We may not have gods that we sacrifice to, but there are definitely endeavors in our lives, things that we chase, that we break our bodies after, that we place and sacrifice ourselves, our relationships with others, our families, our friends, our significant others, for the sake of chasing something. And this, all in all, becomes a sacrifice of sorts to gods that, although we may not call deities, are gods in the sense that they consume our time, our efforts, and our sacrifice. We today are drowning in other gods because of this and them. And it leaks into the deepest truths of who we are. And whatever these gods are, whatever this is for you, and whoever they are for you in your life, it's kind of breaking us apart here. We are plagued by many gods today. And I think we're still struggling to follow and worship the One. I mean, let's go a little closer into this. The Bible explains early on in the book of Genesis, at the creation of humanity, explains that we humans were made in the image of God. And people, they have a lot of different ways of interpreting what this means. Theologians and pastors have theologized on the various meanings of what being in the image of God actually means. But I'm going to take a sort of simplistic approach. Perhaps you might think an overly simplistic approach. But I want to share some of the sort of things, the insights I was thinking about that I found this week. In my study, I realized that there can be no image without an original. There can be no image without the original, of which the image is the reflection of. To be in the image of means that we humans do not stand alone. We are a reflection of something greater than us, something ultimate, something divine. To be a reflection and image of God is to recognize that there are things within that image that fit and correspond and complement that image. And there are things that just simply don't. We have been created in the image, the reflection, the outline of God. And time again, we try to go into Photoshop and sort of overlay different images, different reflections, by choosing and filling our lives with things that fundamentally just don't jive with God's image. There's a sense in which, as reflections, we are not the totality of the image of God. We're just mere reflections here. And there's almost a sense in which our reflectionness yearns for completeness. But that completeness is outlined in the image of God, and sometimes we forget that. And we try to fill that reflection, that image. We try to paint in the lines a little bit harder, become a little bit more fulfilled, find a little bit more meaning and purpose by chasing things that ultimately don't fit in what it means with being in the image of God, being in reflection of God's image. We long for fulfillment and purpose and meaning, and God just says, look at me. Look into the mirror. You're a reflection of me. Our identity lies in the reflection of God. For the sailors, they knew that identity is always rooted in the things we look forward to, the things that we look toward to save us and keep us comfortable. They knew that whatever we look toward and give allegiance to, that's the thing that roots our identity. To know who you are is to know what you have given yourself to, what controls you. What do you fundamentally trust? This past year has been a test of many of these things. What did I run to this year for stability and security? I want to pick up this story in verse 9 of Jonah. We're still in chapter 1. It's been a couple of weeks now, but we're still in chapter 1. And Jonah finally responds to the sailors. It reads, Jonah answered, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land. The sailors were terrified when they heard this, for he had already told them he was running away from the Lord. Oh, why did you do it? They groaned. And since the storm was getting worse all the time, they asked him, what should we do to you to stop this storm? Jonah finally, reluctantly speaks in the story. The first time that he speaks in the story here, we kind of zero in on his words. And after being questioned and asked these questions by these sailors, he answers the questions in an interesting way. And scholars and commentators have kind of looked at his words quite closely and sort of the emphasis in the original language and to see any nuance that they could find in his response. And some scholars, they infer by Jonah's response that because he identified himself first ethnically, then religiously, that perhaps his ethnicity is foremost in his self-identity. And this might seem a little far-fetched. It might seem like we're just playing into race. But this sort of supports why Jonah was so opposed to calling Nineveh to repentance, why he was so opposed to bringing God's word to them. The idea of calling people other than the nation of God's people to faith was not appealing to Jonah in any sort of way. And it kind of shows this sort of shallow identity in Jonah that's formed. And you'll have to forgive me because I'm going to be a little bit harsh on Jonah. And I don't mean to bag on Jonah so hard, but I think there's something here that's happening that we see time and time again throughout history. Because just as in Jonah's life, God and his love is not our identity's most fundamental level. Shallow identities explain why professing Christians can be racist and greedy materialists. All of this comes because it's not Christ's love, but the world's power, approval, comfort, and control that are the real roots of our self-identity. What we see here with Jonah is that Jonah was in this privileged position. He was this prophet of God. He was part of the covenant community, and yet he was so blinded and so unaware of himself. And that's the problem with shallow identity. It prevented him from seeing himself. He identified more with the custom of his culture, of his status in his place, in his society, as a person of the covenant. He leaned into those religious formations more strongly than into the calling of God in his life. Then more strongly than God's love in his life. And we see examples of shallow identity. And I wonder if the identities that we are building today also prevent us from seeing ourselves. A lot of this story has been about Jonah's self-recognition. And I wonder that if we also inevitably taking a role in building our own identities have been placing other identities prior to the most fundamental one, which is the image of God, the image in which we were created. And Jonah's story, it reminds me of someone else in the Bible. It reminds me of Peter. Peter was an extremely important character in Jesus' life. He was one of the most, how can we describe it? Eccentric of Jesus' disciples, perhaps, right? But Peter's fundamental identity was not rooted as much in Jesus' gracious love for him as it was in his commitment and love to Jesus. And I'm going to say that again because I think that's a fundamental point here that ties this story together for Jonah, for Peter, and for us today. That Peter's most fundamental identity was not rooted as much in Jesus' gracious love for him as it was in his own commitment and love to Jesus. What does that mean? It means that his identity, how he saw himself, was rooted in the level of commitment to Christ that he thought he had achieved. Peter was confident, wasn't he? Walking with Jesus, hanging out with the disciples, he was confident in his role as Jesus' disciple. He was confident in his commitment before Jesus. As a devoted follower of Christ, he was so sure in his ability, in his strength, in his commitment to Jesus. And yet, this misplaced identity, perhaps, misplaced as in the fundamental level, leads to two things in Peter, which Jonah also shares. It leads to Peter's blindness, and it leads to Peter's hostility. We see blindness from Peter, blindness to his real self, because if he got his sense of worth from how courageous he was, how ready he was for his commitment, he had no way of recognizing what Jesus was talking about all along. If you base your identity on your goodness, on your virtue, we will inevitably live lives of denial, of places where we can continue to grow, where identity can't handle the admittance of sins or weakness or flaws. A self-identity that's tied too strongly, that overshadows Jesus' gracious love for him, leads to blindness. And the second result of this is hostility. Rather than respect for the people who are different than them, Peter lashes out in hostility. If his blindness would not have been so severe, he would have understood that this arrest, that what was coming was all part of Jesus' plan. That what he was witnessing was already foretold. And instead, Peter pulled out a sword and he cut off the ear of one of the soldiers. See, an identity based on one's own achievement and performance is an insecure identity, because you're never sure if you've done enough. And it's a fragile place to be. any identity that's based on anything but the gracious love of Jesus is suspect. For Peter and for Jonah, they witnessed these things together. They were blinded by their own formulations of identity and were later hostile to those who were different because of it. For Jonah, he couldn't see past his notions of the Ninevites. And it wasn't till sitting in that boat, being in the very depths with them, noticing their own faithfulness, their own version of faithfulness, that Jonah began to realize that perhaps his assumptions and his prejudice about who these pagans were might have been misfounded. The story continues, and in response to his questions, he says, "Throw me into the sea, and it will become calm again. I know that this terrible storm is all my fault." Instead, the sailors rowed even harder to get the ship to the land. See, before, Jonah didn't even want to save the pagans. He didn't want to go to Assyria to save the Ninevites. And yet here now we're beginning to see a change. His self-recognition is starting to happen, and he's starting to realize the plight of these people, recognizing their fear. And he's ready to self-sacrifice himself. And instead of throwing him over, he sees their compassion even so. They're saying, "We're going to row. We're going to get you to land. We're going to try at least." Upon realizing that the effort was futile, the storm was only getting stronger, the story continues, they cried out to the Lord, Jonah's God. They said, "Oh Lord," they pleaded, "don't make us die for this man's sin. And don't hold us responsible for his death." They are noticing the severity, the weight of the situation here. And they said, "Oh Lord, you have sent this storm upon him for your own good reasons." Then the sailors picked Jonah up and threw him into the raging sea, and the storm stopped at once. The sailors were awestruck by the Lord's great power, and they offered him a sacrifice and vowed to serve him. Peter and Jonah were both proud of their religious devotion. They're both confident up until the point in which they were just completely not. Their commitment was based on their self-image, on their spiritual achievements. And as a result, they were both blind to flaws, and they were both battled with hostility to those who were different. Jonah, he shows no concern for the spiritual condition of the Ninevites, nor any interest in working together with the sailors, up until this moment of self-recognition begins to shape him, begins to form him, where those questions pierce through his identity. The pattern of recognition happens. An image of God perhaps emerges. This is perhaps why there are connections in the New Testament where Jesus compares himself to the self-sacrificial love of Jonah. But for Jonah, he's treated these pagans as others, and he's acted in ways of exclusion up until this change and transformation begins to happen. Shallow identities are dangerous. Identities based on on our own achievement, our own commitments, and our own performance, even as Christians, is ultimately an insecure identity. You're never sure when you have done enough. And one, under that blindness and hostility, is susceptible of going too far. I think this week we saw a manifestation of a shallow, obtuse, selfish self-identity take place when we saw that gunman enter all of these places, these parlors, and shoot innocent people. Someone self-proclaimed as a deeply religious person, who I would say's own self-identity was flawed, misplaced. It's a challenge that we face. It's a challenge that we face, that we need to realize that our identity stems only in the loving grace and action of Jesus Christ. That is where it's founded. That is where it begins. That is our solid ground. Our identity is not in our commitment, in our actions, in our performance. Our identity is in the fact that God has acted first, and that God so loved the world that he could no longer let us go on. That's the identity, that's the image of God, the reflection that we are God's own. Not that we are God's, that we are God's own. Right? As readers of this story, we begin to recognize that it's Jonah who's in desperate need of the very mercy of the very God that he finds at this moment so troubling. Under the power of God's grace, his identity is going to have to change. And under God's grace, our identity is going to have to change as well. God's incredible mercy, God's incredible grace, God's incredible love. You know, pastors who preach on love often get a lot of flack. They call them too weak, that there's no substance to what it is that they preach. And whatever your feelings about that may be, the truth is that love is the thing that has changed history. That love is the thing that John says is the reason that God came to be among us. Emmanuel, God with us. What would it look like if our identity today was shaped, was formed, was founded by God's initial act, rather than our response to that act? It's a slight difference. It's a slight nuance. But I think it can make the world of difference. I think our world today needs people, needs believers, needs Christians who understand that our identity is fixated on Christ, Jesus, and only Jesus. And so may we together as a community of God, recognize that and build our identities together from there. The story of Jonah continues, and he's going to struggle building his new identity. But here we are going to be along for the ride. May as we read Jonah's story, may we also begin to see the transformative grace of Jesus Christ. As we lead up to Easter weekend, we're going to see the connections. We're going to draw some comparisons between Jonah and Jesus here. And we're going to see the transformative power of this love. May we today lean in to that identity. Amen. Good morning and happy Sabbath, church. Thanks for joining us here this morning. If it's your first time joining us, please check out our website. There you'll find information about who we are, when we meet, and some updates about our changing schedule. For those who visit us more regularly or who have connected with us before, likewise, please check out our website. Our service structure will be changing in the next 2 weeks, and so stay tuned to those changes. In the meantime, I hope you're staying safe, I hope you're staying well, and I want to wish you all a happy Sabbath.